Today I'm going to show you guys how to brew one of the best light beers that I've ever tasted. I'm going to be using Safe Ale US 05, my dry yeast from Fermentus. Here are the ingredients that I'm going to be using for this batch. I have a 2-row as a base malt. I'm going to be using 3 pounds of this. I have an American Pale Ale. I'm going to use 2 pounds of this. And then some flake corn. I'm going to use 2 pounds, maybe 3 pounds. I'm going to be using Simcoe as my hops. I'm going to use a total of 2 ounces, one of which will be a dry hop. You'll need about 8 gallons of water. Do a 5.5 gallon batch. I like to use a little bit of yeast nutrient before the ferment. When we're ready to keg, I'm going to use some gelatin finings, which really clears up the beer. Once this batch is complete, it's going to go here in my keezer. I have one open tap. I'll give you a quick run through of the equipment that I'm going to be using for this all-grain brew recipe. Your setup may be different than mine. There's a variety of ways that you can do this. This is just the way that I like to do it and the way that I've been doing it for a long time. If you're an experienced brewer, you may want to skip this section, but if you're new to brewing, this information might be very useful. Here's a quick run through of the equipment that I'll be using. I have this igloo cooler that I use as my lauter tun. Now if you look down inside, see I have this strainer. I use that to strain out the grains. The drain plug is situated perfectly. So for my brew kettle, I have this mega pot. I have this gas 1 propane burner. I think this is like 300,000 BTUs. This thing's insane. It gets hot very fast. I have a whisk that I use for agitating the grains. This I use for scooping the grains. This is my pitcher that I use for my Vorloff and just pouring hot water for my Sparge. This is my hot water kettle. So I use this to warm up my Sparge water. I have a thermometer, my scale, miscellaneous towels and mitts. I have this auto siphon that I'm not going to be using today on brew day. That'll be used when I'm ready to transfer the beer from the carboy over to the keg. I have my glass carboys. You only need 1 for this. This is a 6 gallon. This is a 5 gallon. I'm going to be using the 6 gallon. Just gives me a little bit extra room. And during fermentation, you don't want it to overflow. And finally, I have my corny keg, which is where it'll go after the primary fermentation. Then I'll let it sit in here and ferment. Use this as a secondary, so it'll ferment for another maybe 2 weeks or so before I add the gelatin finings and stick it in the refrigerator and start to carbonate it. Now again, if you're new to brewing, you might not have all of this equipment. You can do this with one of the kits that they sell at, say, Northern Brewer. There are just a couple of buckets, and you can get a cooler to use for your lauter tun like I did, and it's pretty easy to get started. All right, so the first step, and one of the most important steps, is to make sure that you sanitize all of your equipment. Now I like to do 1 batch of sanitizing water and sanitize all of my equipment with that 1 batch of water. So I'll do like a 5-ish gallon batch of water and use 1 ounce of star sand. And I'll start by filling up my largest piece first, which is my cooler. So I'll fill up the cooler and I'll throw all my utensils inside the cooler. I'll fill that up with the star sand and with the water, and I'll let it sit for about 20 minutes, and then I'll transfer everything over to the brew pot. And then once that's finished, then I'll transfer it over to the carboy and to my water kettle. And then once that's all done, then I'll go ahead and I'll sanitize the keg last. You can see the suds coming out the top. Okay, so while the equipment is sanitizing, I want to take a moment to let you guys know that I used to brew in the house, in the kitchen, climate controlled. We're in Florida, so it does get hot, but it really stinks up the house, which is why I started doing it out in the garage. So there's a couple of benefits. 1, the house doesn't stink, and 2, I can heat up my brew kettle much faster with this outdoor 300,000 BTU propane burner, and it really shortens the brew process by a couple hours. So when this water goes into the lauter tun, it should be somewhere between 158 and 165 degrees. So I'm going to bring this up to 175 degrees, and then as I transfer it over, it's going to level off right in that range inside the cooler. While that water is heating up, I'm going to start adding my grains to the lauter tun. I'm going to start with the 2-row. Now I've already measured this, and I know that I have 8 pounds. And I want about 3 pounds in the lauter tun. I'm going to add it directly from the bag, and then weigh the bag until I have 5 pounds left. I'm going to place my strainer. So I started with 8, I have 5 left, which means I have 3 in the lauter tun. I'm going to check my water temperature at 120. Next, I'm going to add the pale ale, 2 pounds. Lastly, I'm going to add the corn. Flaked corn. Alright, so I checked the temperature of the water. The water is at 175 right now. So I'm going to bring it over here. I'm going to start slowly adding it to the lauter tun. Now some folks will say that 175 is too hot, and it is too hot, but as I'm transferring it over, that temperature is going to drop, and by the time I'm finished with the transfer, it's going to be right there between 158 and 165 degrees. I'm going to continue to add this water until I have maybe about an inch to an inch and a half over the top layer of the grains. Then I'll close it up and I'll let it sit for an hour. Now some of this water is going to absorb into the grains. Wait for it to absorb and then get that extra inch on top. We use the whisk to agitate the grains. And we might see some bubbling come up in the areas that it's seeping into. You can take the temperature reading at this point to make sure that you're at the right temperature. Add any hot water if you need to, or any cooler water if you need to. But I've done this so many times, I know that's going to end up exactly where it needs to be. So of the 3 gallons that I had in here, I used about 2.5 gallons, and that looks like that's going to be plenty. So I'm going to close this up, start my timer for 1 hour, and let it sit. And I'll be ready to start cycling it through, starting the sparge process. Alright, so while I'm waiting for that 1 hour rest, I went ahead and I filled up my hot water kettle again in preparation for my sparge. So I filled that up with about another 5 gallons. I haven't turned on the heat yet. I'll turn on the burner about 15 minutes before my 60-minute timer is up and start warming up that water. And it should be ready at the same time that this finishes. So now I'm going to start the sparge process. So I'm going to move this up here. I'm going to put the brew kettle under the lauter tun spout. So now I'm going to do what's called Vorloff. So I'm going to catch the first pitcher that comes out of the spout when it opens, and feed it back into the lauter tun. It's going to catch any grains. You're going to come out initially, and hopefully the grains will clump together and form an additional filter. And we'll slowly pour this back in. As this level drops in here, I'm going to cycle more hot water through until we have probably about 7.5 gallons in the brew kettle. I'm doing this very slowly, just a trickle. And again, you want to do this as the level gets lower. You want to wait until the top layer isn't fully saturated any longer, because basically what you're doing is rinsing the last of the sugars that are on the grains through the screen and into the pot. Alright, this is coming to the end. I'm going to make sure that I have about 7 gallons in here before I start the boil, maybe 7.5. Since this is almost finished, I'm going to start measuring out my first round of hops that I'm going to pitch at the start of the boil. So I'm going to pitch half an ounce at the start of the boil, half an ounce at 30 minutes remaining, and then another ounce will be our dry hop at the end. Now some folks will add water straight to the pot to bring it up to your target volume. Now that's fine if you're extract brewing, but you really don't want to do that when you're all grain brewing. You want to extract all the sugars possible. So you want to run all that water through the lauter tun into your brew kettle. All right, I'm going to start the heat while I wait for this last half gallon to run through the lauter tun. We're going to wait for this to come up to a boil. We started with about 8 gallons of water, and I think we probably lost about a gallon or so to absorption inside the lauter tun. And then during the boil, we'll probably lose between 1 and 1.5 gallons. I'm getting close to the boiling point, so I want to keep an eye on this. And once we hit 212, this thing can boil over real fast. So I'm going to watch it, and I'm going to turn the temperature down. I'm going to turn the burner down once it starts to boil, because it will just go right over if I don't do that. And then also, when you pitch your first batch of hops, you also want to do that slowly, because those hops will cause it to boil right over as well. "30 minutes left. I'm going to pitch the second half ounce of the hops. We have 2 minutes left in the boil. The next step is going to be rapidly cooling the wort as quickly as you can. There's a couple different ways that you can do it. So you can use a wort chiller if you have one. I don't have one. Another method that you can use is you can do an ice bath in either a large sink, if you have like a utility sink, or a bathtub. Since we moved into this new house, we have a swimming pool in back with a swim up ledge or a bench, and at the perfect height for me just to throw the kettle in there on the bench. I put something underneath of it so the heat from the kettle doesn't come in direct contact of the cement bench, but that works really well. It cools it down very quickly. I know that that method is a little bit unorthodox, but works really well for me. All right, I just finished transferring from the brew kettle to the carboy. Now it's ready for fermentation. When I removed it from the pool, it was at 80 degrees, which was the temperature of the water in the pool. So then I brought it inside. So now it's down to 76 degrees. So now I'm going to pitch the yeast. All right, so I have Fermentus Safe Ale US 05. All right, so yeast is pitched. This is kind of full. Usually I like to have a little bit more space. So I'm a little bit concerned that this might overflow. So I'm going to keep an eye on it and we'll see what it does. I'm doing the transfer over to the keg. I'll let it sit for another week in the keg for conditioning. Then I'm going to add some gelatin finings for clarity. Then I'll drop it in the keezer and hook it up for carbonation. And here's the final product. Still a little foggy. About in another 2 weeks, the gelatin finings will clear that up, be crystal clear.